My name is Robert Turner, and I'm 65 years old. I never thought I would be telling this story. But life has a way of taking turns you never see coming. I had been married to Margaret for 40 years. She was my best friend, my partner in everything, and the woman who knew me better than anyone else. We built a life together from the ground up. We raised one child, our daughter, Claire. From the day she was born, I made it my mission to be the kind of father who showed up at school plays, parent-teacher meetings, soccer games, and the late-night talks when she cried over teenage heartbreak. Margaret and I sacrificed a lot to give her the life we wished we had growing up. We paid for her college so she wouldn't have to start adulthood in debt. We helped her with the down payment on her first house. We stood behind her in every decision, even the ones we didn't fully agree with. When she married David, I tried my best to welcome him into the family. I knew he wasn't perfect, no one is, but I thought if Claire loved him, that was enough. Margaret, though, always had reservations. She told me once, "Robert, I just feel like he's not going to put her first when it matters." I told her not to worry. I wanted to believe the best. Margaret's health started to decline about 3 years ago. It began with small things, fatigue, aches that wouldn't go away, but soon, it became clear it was something serious. Cancer. We fought it together. Every chemo session, every hospital stay, every sleepless night, I was there. Claire visited, but not often. She always had a reason: work deadlines, weekend plans, David's family events. Margaret never complained to her about it, but I could see the sadness in her eyes every time Claire said she couldn't come. By the time we knew the end was near, I had already prepared myself in the practical sense: paperwork, funeral arrangements, but nothing can prepare you emotionally. Margaret passed away on a Thursday morning in April. She took her last breath with her hand in mine. The house felt unbearably quiet afterward. I called Claire to tell her. She cried, of course. I told her the funeral would be on Sunday afternoon so her cousins from out of state could make it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Dad? Sunday is David's birthday. We have plans already. Can't it be another day?" I remember gripping the phone tighter, thinking I must have misheard. "This is your mother's funeral," I said slowly. "I know, Dad," she replied, "but we've been planning this trip for weeks. David will be so disappointed if I cancel. I'll come by next week to see you, I promise." Her words felt like a punch to the chest. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I just told her I understood and hung up. Sunday came. The church was filled with friends, relatives, and neighbors. People who had loved Margaret, who had taken the time to say goodbye. But Claire wasn't there. Every time the church door creaked open, a small part of me hoped she'd walk in at the last moment. She never did. Afterward, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the chair where Margaret used to sit. Grief mixed with something else, something darker. It wasn't just disappointment in my daughter. It was a deep, bone-deep realization that the bond one thought we had might not be as strong as I believed. Days passed, and Claire called as promised. She asked how I was holding up. I told her the truth: not well. She apologized for missing the funeral, saying David had been upset when she brought it up and she didn't want to ruin his birthday. As if that explanation would make it better. I didn't argue. I just listened. But inside, a decision was starting to form. I had a will, written years ago, leaving everything to Claire: our house, savings, investments, and some land Margaret had inherited. Margaret always said, "It's for Claire. She's our only child. She'll take care of it when we're gone." But now, I wasn't sure. Taking care of something requires showing up when it matters. And Claire hadn't. In the weeks that followed, I began making quiet arrangements. I met with my lawyer. I visited the land Margaret loved so much, walking its trails, remembering the picnics we used to have there. I thought about who in my life had been there for me, not just in the good times, but in the worst moments. Faces came to mind. One of them belonged to my niece, Hannah. She's 32, works as a nurse, and lives 2 towns over. She drove over in the middle of the night when she heard Margaret was in the hospital. She stayed with me through the first 2 days after the funeral, cooking meals I didn't have the appetite for and making sure I drank water. She didn't do it for money. She did it because she cared. I started to think about what leaving everything to someone like her would mean. Someone who understood the value of family, who didn't measure love by convenience. One rainy afternoon, I sat in my lawyer's office and signed the papers. My estate, everything I had built and saved with Margaret, would go to Hannah. Claire wouldn't know. Not yet. There would be a time for that conversation, but it wasn't now. When I left the lawyer's office, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness that it had come to this. Relief that I had made a decision that felt right. Claire called a week later, asking if I wanted to have dinner. We met at a small Italian place in town. She talked about her life, her job, her friends, upcoming vacations. Not once did she ask about how I'd been coping since the funeral. It wasn't that she didn't care, I told myself. Maybe she just didn't know how to ask. But the distance between us felt wider than ever. I watched her smile as she described a new restaurant she and David wanted to try. I nodded, but inside, I knew that something between us had shifted permanently. I didn't tell her about the will that night. I didn't tell her that my trust had been quietly moved elsewhere. Some truths take time to reveal. And some change everything when they're spoken. The night ended with a polite hug and promises to see each other soon. I drove home through empty streets, thinking about Margaret. She would have been heartbroken by what happened. But maybe, just maybe, she would have understood why I had to do what I did. Because love isn't just about words. It's about showing up when it matters most. And when that moment came, Claire didn't. The papers were signed. The decision was made. But the story between my daughter and me wasn't over. Not yet. There were still things unsaid. And I knew that one day, they would come to the surface. The days grew shorter, and autumn rolled in, painting the trees outside my window in shades of gold and deep red. I found myself sitting on the porch most evenings, wrapped in Margaret's old knitted blanket, listening to the wind moving through the leaves. Her scent still lingered faintly in the fibers, and I clung to it like a lifeline. Grief was no longer a sharp knife, it had dulled into a heavy weight that I carried everywhere. And beneath it all was the quiet ache of disappointment that wouldn't let go. I hadn't told Claire about the will. Part of me wanted to, but another part wasn't ready for the inevitable storm that would follow. She still called, still texted occasionally, but our conversations were lighter now, as if neither of us dared to step into the shadowed territory of what had happened. It was on a cold Friday morning when Hannah stopped by unexpectedly. She was still in her scrubs, hair pulled back into a loose bun, eyes tired but warm. "I had a shift ending near here," she said, handing me a paper bag that smelled like fresh pastries. "I thought you could use breakfast that doesn't come from a box." We sat at the kitchen table, eating in comfortable silence. After a while, she looked at me carefully. "You've been quiet lately, Uncle Robert. Not just grief quiet. Something else." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I studied her face, the kind of attentiveness you give to someone who's proven, time and again, that they won't disappear when things get difficult. She didn't push me for an answer, just waited. Finally, I said, "I changed my will." Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "Oh. I left everything to you," I continued, my voice steady. Her eyes widened. "Uncle Robert. I know you didn't ask for it. That's exactly why." She set her fork down and reached across the table, her hand warm against mine. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just know that Margaret and I loved you like our own." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she gave my hand a squeeze and changed the subject to something lighter, as if she understood that I didn't have the strength for more. After she left, I sat alone for a long time, thinking about how strange it was that sometimes the people you think will be there for you aren't, and the ones you least expect step in without hesitation. The following week, Claire called and invited me to a family dinner she was hosting for David's parents. I went, though part of me dreaded the evening. Their home was beautiful, large, modern, with the kind of sterile perfection you see in magazines. Claire greeted me with a smile that felt a little too rehearsed. Dinner was pleasant enough, though most of the conversation revolved around David's business and his parents' upcoming trip to Italy. At one point, David made a joke about how I must be rattling around alone in that big old house now. Claire laughed politely, but her eyes flicked to me, searching for a reaction. I only smiled faintly and said nothing. After dessert, while David and his parents were in the kitchen, Claire leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Dad, you've been different lately. Is something wrong?" I hesitated, swirling the last sip of coffee in my cup. "Things change, Claire. People change." She frowned. "If this is about the funeral, it's not just about that," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Her mouth tightened. "Dad, I've explained." I set the cup down and looked at her directly. "You thought David's birthday was more important than your mother's funeral." Her cheeks flushed. "That's not fair." "Maybe not. But it's how it felt." She looked like she wanted to argue, but before she could, David returned and the moment dissolved into polite small talk. I left soon after, the chill outside feeling almost welcome against my skin. The distance between us had widened again, and I wasn't sure it could ever be bridged. In the weeks that followed, I poured myself into small projects around the house. Fixing a leaky faucet. Repainting the front steps. Clearing out the attic. It was in that attic that I found a box Margaret had labeled in her neat handwriting, "Claire's childhood." Inside were school drawings, birthday cards, photographs of her missing front teeth and beaming smile. I sat on the dusty floor, holding those memories in my hands, and wondered where that little girl had gone. And if I'd somehow lost her along the way. One evening, Hannah called to check in. She mentioned that a patient's family had brought in flowers to thank her, and she didn't have space for them at her apartment. "Do you want them?" she asked. When she arrived with a large bouquet of white lilies, I felt an unexpected lump in my throat. Margaret had loved lilies. We set them in a vase by the window, and for the first time in weeks, the house smelled alive. Later that night, I sat in the living room, the only light coming from the lamp beside me, and I realized something quietly unsettling. Claire hadn't been inside this house since before the funeral. Not once. She'd invited me to her home, met me for dinners, called on the phone, but she hadn't stepped foot into the place she grew up. The realization lodged in my chest like a splinter. I didn't know whether it was avoidance, guilt, or simply disinterest. But I knew it meant something. The next Sunday, I called her. "Claire, I was thinking maybe you could come by. I have some of your things here from when you were little." There was a pause. "Oh. I don't know if I can this weekend, Dad. David's parents are visiting again." I closed my eyes. "All right," I said softly. "Another time." But in my heart, I didn't believe that another time would come anytime soon. As winter set in, the holidays loomed closer. Margaret had always made them magical, filling the house with the smell of baking, decorating every corner. I tried to keep some traditions alive, but it felt hollow without her laughter in the background. Hannah came by on Christmas Eve, bringing a homemade pie and a small wrapped box. Inside was a framed photo of Margaret and me from years ago, taken during a picnic. "I thought you'd like to have it where you can see it every day," she said. I swallowed hard, managing only a quiet, "Thank you." Claire called that night, saying she and David were skiing with friends and wouldn't make it for Christmas this year. I told her to enjoy herself. After the call ended, I sat in the dim light of the tree, the silence pressing in from all sides. I thought about the will again. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about meaning. About leaving something behind with someone who would understand its worth, not just the financial value, but the history, the love, the sacrifices embedded in every brick and blade of grass. Hannah understood. "Claire, I wasn't sure anymore. But I also knew the story between us wasn't finished. Life has a way of forcing truths into the open, even when you try to keep them buried. And I had a feeling that day would come sooner than either of us expected."
January arrived with bitter winds that rattled the windows and pushed the snow into high drifts against the porch. I found myself spending more time indoors, the quiet of the house amplified by the absence of Margaret's voice. Some days, I kept the television on just to have a trace of human sound in the background. Hannah called often, sometimes just for a few minutes during her lunch breaks at the hospital. Her voice was a tether to the outside world, reminding me that someone cared enough to check in without needing a reason. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old tax documents, the phone rang. It was Claire. Her voice was unusually bright, almost rehearsed. "Dad, how would you feel about coming to dinner next weekend? We're inviting some friends over, and I think you'd enjoy meeting them." Part of me wanted to decline, to avoid the polite conversations and the subtle undercurrent of tension that always seemed to hum between us lately. But I agreed. When Saturday came, I dressed in my best sweater, the one Margaret had given me 2 Christmases ago. The drive to Claire's house was quiet, the road slick with patches of ice. When I arrived, David greeted me at the door, a drink in hand, the smell of roasting meat drifting from the kitchen. Claire appeared a moment later, giving me a hug that felt slightly more genuine than the last one. The evening unfolded in the usual way, small talk about work, weather, vacation plans. But there was a moment during dessert when Claire leaned toward me and said, "Dad, I've been thinking about the house, about Mom's things. Maybe it's time we started talking about what happens in the future."
Mai fort que pose dal fouet tout maimut.
"What do you mean?" She smiled lightly, but her eyes were sharp. "Well, it's a big place for you to keep up with. I was thinking, maybe in a year or 2, you could downsize. David and I could help you sell it, and you could move somewhere more manageable."
I set the fork down slowly.
"And what would happen to the house?"
She hesitated only a moment.
"We could buy it. Keep it in the family. It would be a great place to raise kids someday." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I took a sip of coffee, keeping my voice even. That's something to think about. But inside, my mind was already turning. She still had no idea. No idea that the decision had already been made. No idea that the house she was imagining her future in had been promised to someone else. The rest of the night passed without incident, but when I left, The cold air outside felt sharper, almost cleansing. I drove home with my thoughts tangled, wondering if she would ever understand why I had done what I did. A week later, Hannah stopped by after her shift. We had tea at the kitchen table, steam curling between us. She told me about a difficult night at the hospital, about holding the hand of a patient who had no family. Her voice trembled slightly when she spoke about it, and I realized she carried the weight of other people's losses alongside her own. "You have a big heart," I said quietly. She shook her head. "I just do what I hope someone would do for me." It struck me then, Hannah's way of living was exactly what Margaret valued most. Not words, not promises, but action. Showing up when it mattered. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Claire again. I remembered the little girl who used to wait by the window for me to come home from work, running into my arms before I even reached the front steps. I remembered her laughter, her small hand gripping mine. And I wondered how that little girl had grown into a woman who could choose a party over her mother's funeral. The thought ached like an old injury. February crept in, cold and gray. Claire called less often now. When she did, the conversations were short, filled with updates about her social calendar and David's business. One evening, she mentioned casually that they were thinking of remodeling their kitchen. "It's going to be expensive," she said with a laugh. "But we figure it's an investment in the future." I didn't respond. I was thinking about how different our definitions of investment had become. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail, a handwritten note from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. His wife had passed away the year before, and he wrote about the loneliness, the long hours of silence, the strange feeling of being untethered. His words mirrored my own experience so closely that it was almost like reading a page from my own journal. I decided to write back. It felt good to put thoughts to paper, to share the parts of my life I couldn't say out loud to Claire. Weeks passed. One evening, as I was making soup, the phone rang. It was Claire. Her voice was different this time, hesitant. "Dad, David's been offered a job in another state. It's a big opportunity. We're thinking of taking it."
Il ind against the kunte, the lad din maillant forgotten.
"That's a big move," I said. "Yeah. We'd be farther away, but we could still visit. Maybe you could visit us too." Her tone was light, as if distance was just a minor inconvenience. I said the polite things, how I wanted her to be happy, how I hoped it worked out. But inside, I felt something settle. If she left, the gap between us would grow into a chasm. And maybe that was inevitable. That night, I pulled out the box of Claire's childhood things again. I went through each drawing, each photograph, wondering which ones she might actually want if I offered them. I thought about calling her, about inviting her over just to talk, but I knew she'd have an excuse. Instead, I placed the box back in the attic. Some things, it seemed, were meant to wait. The snow began to melt in March, revealing patches of muddy ground. Hannah came by with gardening gloves and a bag of bulbs. "Margaret loved tulips," she said. "Let's plant some for spring." We worked side by side in the cold earth, our breath visible in the air. It felt good, simple, grounding. As we finished, I imagined the flowers blooming in a few weeks, a quiet reminder that life could still push through the cold. When Hannah left, I stood on the porch and watched her car disappear down the road. I knew the day was coming when Claire would find out about the will. I didn't know how she would react. But I knew that when that day came, it would be the moment everything between us either shattered completely or began to heal. April came with the first signs of green pushing through the thawed ground. The tulips Hannah and I had planted began to emerge, their shoots small but determined. I found myself checking them every morning, as if their slow progress was a quiet reassurance that life still had its rhythms. Claire called less often now. When she did, our conversations felt like two people speaking across a wide river, still able to see each other, but too far to bridge the gap easily. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the yard in warm gold, I received a call from her. "Dad, we've made a decision," she said. "David's accepted the job."
Oui, elle be moving by the end of summer.
There was a pause, as if she expected me to argue.
"I hope it's what you want," he said softly.
"It is. I think it'll be good for us." Her voice wavered slightly, but she masked it quickly. We spoke for a few more minutes, then said our goodbyes. After the call, I sat on the porch and watched the light fade. The realization settled in. Claire's visits would become rare, maybe once or twice a year. And when she did come, it would be brief. The space between us wasn't just physical now, it had become something deeper. The weeks passed quickly. Hannah stopped by often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to sit and share a pot of tea. We didn't always talk about anything important, but her presence filled the quiet spaces in a way that felt steady and safe. One afternoon in early June, I decided it was time. Claire needed to know about the will. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I couldn't leave this truth for her to discover after I was gone. She deserved to hear it from me. I called her and asked if she could come by before the move. She hesitated, then agreed. That Saturday, she arrived wearing a sundress, her hair pulled back. She looked older somehow, not in years, but in the weight she carried in her eyes.
We sat in the living room, the afternoon light spilling across the floor.
"I've been meaning to tell you something," I began. She looked wary. "About the will."
Yves échange dit.
Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?"
Yves left everything to Anna.
The words landed heavily between us. Her face went pale.
You're cutting me out.
I took a breath.
No.
I'm making sure what your mother and I built goes to someone who has been there when it mattered most. Her voice rose.
So you're punishing me?
Because I didn't come to the funeral.
He met her eyes.
I'm doing what I think is right. This isn't about punishment. It's about trust. About showing up.
She shook her head, tears welling. You don't understand.
David, this isn't about David, I said firmly.
It's about you and me.
And what happened showed me that when I needed you most, you weren't there. Her hands trembled in her lap. I made a mistake, she whispered. I didn't answer right away. The room was filled with the sound of the clock ticking on the mantel. Finally, I said, maybe. And maybe one day we'll find our way back from it. But for now, this is how it has to be. She wiped her eyes, looking away. I guess there's nothing I can say to change your mind.
He shook my head slowly. Not today.
We sat in silence for a long moment. Eventually, she stood, smoothing her dress.
He should go.
I walked her to the door. She paused on the porch, her eyes searching mine.
I love you, Dad, she said softly.
I love you too, I replied. And I meant it. She turned and walked to her car, and I watched her drive away until she disappeared down the road. The house felt especially quiet after she left. I stood in the yard for a while, looking at the tulips. They had begun to bloom, bright colors opening toward the sun.
Life, moving forward.
That evening, Hannah stopped by with a container of soup. She noticed my quiet mood but didn't press. Instead, we sat on the porch, watching the last light fade. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. Not because everything was resolved, it wasn't. But because the truth was finally out in the open. And now, whatever happened next would happen with nothing left unsaid.